The election victory are pouring in for Emmanuel Macron from all across the world. With our guest, Boucek Francoise, visiting research fellow and associate of the Center for European Research, we will talk about Emmanuel Macron's foreign policy and what direction his policies will take in the next coming years. Hello and welcome to TVP World.
Good morning.
So when you're looking at the potential opportunities and challenges for Emmanuel Macron, which are the most important ones at the present stage? What do you think should be, and indeed is, on Emmanuel Macron's mind when he thinks about making his next moves in foreign policy?
Well, actually, I don't think foreign policy is the priority today for him, because they are now looking at the legislative elections happening in a few weeks' time. So I think the focus, given the outcome of yesterday's election, will be on domestic policies, because this is what he's trying to really address in terms of wanting to build this coalition of support that he was talking about yesterday. But in terms of foreign policy, I don't see a great deal of change. I think there will be a continuation of putting the accent on Europe and NATO. And I don't see really any great departure from that. Perhaps even a reinforcement of the European mandate in terms of this coordinated approach that he's pushing more and more all the time. But really, I think domestic policies will be more a priority.
So when it comes to domestic policies, of course, this is a question of being able to confront the followers of Marine Le Pen and, of course, catering to the expectations of his own voter base. Now, Emmanuel Macron himself, following his election victory, following the announcement that was made that he indeed was triumphant in these elections, has made a statement concerning the immediate future of what he's going to do. Let's take a look at what Emmanuel Macron said. We should be able to play this clip in just a few seconds. So please do bear with me.
Je sais aussi que nombre de nos compatriotes ont voté ce jour pour moi.
I also know that many of our compatriots have voted for me today not in order to support the ideas that I stand for, but to block those of the extreme right. And I want to thank them and tell them that I am aware that this vote obliges me for the years to come. I am the custodian of their sense of duty, of their attachment to the Republic, and the respect for the differences that have been expressed in recent weeks.
So this sense of custodianship of the ideas which essentially have laid the groundwork for the French Republic, do you think this is what Emmanuel Macron will be thinking about during the next few weeks and the next few months? Because you've mentioned this focus on parliamentary elections. Do you think Macron thinks that the extreme right or perhaps some other political groups may actually claim victory in parliamentary elections, riding perhaps a wave of discontent on domestic issues?
Well, it's difficult to preempt what the parliamentary election results will be at this point. There is a lot of talks already and coalition building going on behind the scene, and even La République En Marche, they have already about 150 seats that they think they can hold and reinvest into. So they are going to try and not really compete, because it's a whole different dynamic that happens for the parliamentary elections, because the coalition between parties has to happen locally in each individual constituency. So it depends who holds the seat and what the composition of the party representation is in individual districts at any given location. So it's not a question of so much building national coalition between parties, but more local coalitions. So Marine Le Pen also last night indicated that the campaign for the legislative election was starting right now. So she is definitely going to be campaigning, trying to put candidates in as many seats as they can. And the same thing with Jean-Luc Mélenchon, the extreme left candidate also, who is making claims that he wants to be the prime minister of the next government. But, you know, that's an unlikely prospect. I see more the effort of Macron and his team to really reinforce, consolidate that centrist bloc. Whether that in the long term will actually mean that it becomes the dominant coalition, it's open to question, because once he's gone, what happens to his party, which is still very weak at the grassroots level, whereas the other two parties that have been pretty much devastated in this election, the Socialists and the Republicans, still have very, very strong local organizations.
So knowing that rivalry in the parliamentary elections is going to be rather intense, Emmanuel Macron, as you said, will be watching closely the issues which his voters and the voters of the opposition hold close to their hearts. Now, when it comes to questions of foreign policy, what do French voters, or the majority of French voters, expect from the President of the Republic? What are their preferences when it comes to, for example, the ongoing conflict in Ukraine? Should France do more to help Ukraine fight off the Russian invasion, or should it stay back and adopt a slightly more laid-back stance, one could say, distancing itself from this effort?
Okay, well, in terms of defense and foreign policy, in that way, within the Ukrainian context, the decision-making really happens at NATO level and European level. There is not that much that individual EU countries can do now, even though, in theory, foreign policy is still at the intergovernmental level. So I think there will be a continuation of imposing sanctions on Russia, unlike the Le Pen approach. And continued coordination with the US, within NATO, and at EU level. In terms of furnishing Ukraine with weapons and all that, I guess there are individual arrangements between countries, but I don't think that's a priority anyway for French voters, and I don't think it will be in the legislative election, even less so than for presidential elections, because the issues at stake are much more domestic and local rather than in terms of foreign policy. So I think a continuation of what we've seen, even though Macron last night was trying to depart from the past 5 years, and he said, you know, this is a new 5 years starting now, not the continuation of 5 years. He said 5 new years, indicating he wants to change his style of government even. And I interpreted that as a signal to the radical left, who want a new way of governance, in effect, more consultation with them. This is the youth vote, really, and this is what they've been claiming for. So he also indicated if you consider environmental policy part of foreign policy, and really increasingly it is, because we are looking at global issues in terms of climate change. So I think in that way, we are going to see more and more of a push again at European level. I think he's talking already about perhaps a carbon tax at the EU frontiers and so on.
But also, France has luckily been quite adamant that it will support measures intended to allow Europe to shake off its dependence on Russian resources. And now France obviously is better positioned to do that than, say, Germany, because it has powerful energy reserves stemming from its very own reliance on nuclear power. Do you think that Emmanuel Macron will continue this policy of supporting this sort of sea change when it comes to Europe's dependence on Russian gas and oil, also leaving Germany quite alienated in their refusal to go down that path, at least for the time being, in the near future?
Well, as you say, France relies on nuclear power mostly for its energy needs. Germany is starting to shift now towards more reliance, perhaps on a slight change from the Merkel approach, which was to shut down all nuclear power plants and so on. So we'll have to see. I mean, I really don't know what the dialogue is between those two governments. I mean, it's still early stages for the new chancellor in Germany, and a lot of these kind of talks happens at European level. Again, the national state has really been hollowed out, I think, much more than people realize when it comes to policy making. So I think we are going to see much more, perhaps more grand projects being announced within the EU over the next few years, because now we have then France, Macron in the seat for the next 5 years, and in Germany, again, a long period. So I think we might see a slow development towards a more address to the climate change policies.
But there is always also a question of leadership within the European Union. Do you think Emmanuel Macron will embrace the opportunity to become a European leader at Germany's expense, given that Germany right now is suffering from a slightly tarnished reputation over the situation in Ukraine, whereas France right now may benefit from this increasing confidence of its own leadership? So do you think that France could emerge as the new leader of the European Union?
I'm not sure Macron sees things in that way. Perhaps within the EU, certain countries perceive that as more relevant than others. I think he's more centered on building a consensus, rather than being the one that leads the EU. And of course, as you know, the European Council presidency, which France holds at the moment, will end at the end of June after the legislative election. So I think we might see less visibility, perhaps, of Macron at the European table than we have for the last 3 or 4 months.
And very quickly now, because we have less than a minute left, do you think it is likely that Emmanuel Macron will continue his policy of trying to maintain frequent contact with Vladimir Putin, or will he change that dramatically?
Well, I don't think I am in a position to actually answer that question. I think the situation is developing so rapidly, and I think already over the last 2 or 3 weeks, there has been less dialogue than there was at the very beginning between the two of them. So I'm afraid I don't have a crystal ball that will enable me to answer that question, I'm afraid.
So perhaps the only way to predict the future is looking at Russia's approach, and Russia, unfortunately, seems to be less and less interested in dialogue, and right now it is focusing on making territorial gains in Ukraine and at the same time of attacking civilian population of that country. So it's going to be a major challenge for foreign policy, not just for France, all European countries in the near future. Boucek Francoise was our guest today here on TVP World. Thank you very much for being here with us.
Thank you.